Hi Dragonflies, welcome back to Dragonfly Spirit Studio. I'm Lynn Bauer. This video is part of my online series in how to paint skies and clouds in watercolor. If something in this video is confusing to you because you missed earlier videos, you don't have to search for them all over YouTube. You can go to my website at dragonflyspiritstudio.com and then click the links for Learn and Watercolor Skies and Clouds. All the project and lesson videos are there in order, and there are handouts and templates for the projects and cheat sheets and reference photos. Everything that you need to do the projects are all there in one place. In this video, I'd like to talk a little bit more about stretching paper and about not stretching paper. When I talk about stretching paper, a lot of times I get these questions. If I use 300-pound paper, can I not stretch my paper? If I use a block, can I not stretch my paper? And the answer is yes, of course, those things work in certain conditions. But for the techniques that I'm teaching in this workshop, where we're getting the paper saturated and wetting it repeatedly, I have found that in the long run, it is less work for me to stretch my paper at the beginning and then have this lovely surface to work on and no problems with buckling ever, no matter how much water I put on there. So for me, for these techniques, block doesn't work, 300-pound paper doesn't work. But then you run into the problem of, what if I am in the middle of a painting, my painting is on my stretcher bars, so they're already occupied, or my gator board, and I want to practice a new technique before I try it on my actual painting, or I want to try out 3 or 4 different techniques to see which one I think is going to be the right technique to use in the next step. And I don't have any extra stretchers. I don't have another piece of gator board. To understand what's going on with paper buckling, it helps to take a look at a thinner sheet of paper. This is just copy paper, much thinner than watercolor paper, so things happen a lot more quickly. As we add water to the surface and it soaks through, once the paper is completely saturated, the fibers are attempting to expand like a sponge would expand, but they're blocked by the drier fibers around them, and they can't expand to the side, so the only direction they can expand is up and down, and this creates ridges and valleys. This happens with watercolor paper as well. It just takes a little longer because the watercolor paper is thicker. So here's a piece that I put some water on and I left it off to the side, and you can see this is also bulged where it was wet as the fibers try to expand and have no place to go horizontally, so the only way they can expand is to create that little dome. The same thing happens if you tape down a small sheet of paper. So I wet this and let it have a little bit of time to expand. And as you can see, the tape holds down the outer edge, and so again, the paper expands by bulging upwards as a dome. If it just domes up, then the excess water runs off and it's not a problem. But if you add even more water, as with this sheet, you can see that even with a small sheet, you can wind up with so much expansion upward and downward that you get puddles and ridges between them. And then once that happens, you have a problem with getting your wash distributed evenly. The same thing happens with a block because the gum on the outer edges of the block behaves the same way as the tape and prevents expansion. So paper buckles when it's trying to expand and something, either dry paper or tape or the gum around a block, is preventing it from expanding horizontally, and so it has to expand vertically. Or this can also happen if you have an area on the page that's much wetter, and even though the paper around it's not dry, it's not wet enough to expand to the same amount. So different amounts of moisture. So we solve this problem with stretching by letting the paper expand fully and then securing it in that position. So what I'm going to recommend that you do to practice techniques is to start with the very first step of our paper stretching routine and get the paper completely saturated. So we're going to wet one side, flip it over, wet the other side, flip it back. Our goal is to get the entire sheet of paper to expand fully so that we don't have a problem with some areas trying to expand more than other areas. Now, since our stretchers or gator board are already occupied with our painting, we're simply going to leave this sheet of paper floating on a film of water. That means that if it wants to expand, it can expand horizontally. Nothing is preventing that. And if I add more water to one area, and that area becomes wetter than the rest of the page, the moisture can migrate underneath in the film of water that's underlying our paper, so we never wind up with one area much wetter than another area trying to expand more and causing buckling. So you might be wondering, why bother picking it up and stapling it down to something? Why not just work this way? And the reason is, first of all, it does buckle somewhat as it's drying. So if I'm going to do another layer, I'll have to very carefully saturate it again without disturbing the underlying washes. A bigger concern for me is sometimes if you're not monitoring this drying process, you can wind up with blooms because moisture will collect along the edge. Especially if your table's not perfectly level, which mine is not. My floor is not perfectly level. So there's a slight tip here and the water collects here and then I get a bloom. So I find that trying to monitor that as the paper is drying is enough of an annoyance that I'd rather just stretch my paper on stretchers, because once I get to this point, the only additional step I need to take is to staple it down on stretchers or on my gator board. But for practice piece, where I'm not going to add another layer, I'm just going to check a technique and see if I want to use it. This saves me a lot of time, and it means I don't have to have a whole collection of stretcher bars in every different size just to test a technique that I might want to try on my painting. So you'll see this in action as we learn the various techniques for creating clouds in the later videos in Project 2.